Hello everyone, this is Dr. Matt C. Howard and welcome to week 12 of your Business 255 course. This week we are going to cover moderation with regression. This is a little bit different from your syllabus. Your syllabus said we're going to cover forecasting this week, but we're actually going to put that off for another 2 weeks, mainly because this topic still involves regression, and since we just went over a whole unit on regression, I figured it would probably be a good idea to keep up with regression rather than taking a break and then coming back to it. I hope you don't mind. I think it would work better that way. I think that it would be less confusing that way. So let's go ahead and learn moderation with regression. So as we know with regression, in research and practice, we often investigate the direct effect of variables. So usually when we're thinking about regression or correlation, our questions are things like, does job satisfaction predict job performance? Or things like, does location relate to job commitment? You could test that with ANOVA, but we'll ignore that for now. So typically, thus far in this course, we've been talking about relationships like these, just direct effects, X affects Y, job satisfaction affects job performance, just basic direct effects. However, sometimes we want to investigate whether a variable influences the relationship between two other variables. So sometimes we're not necessarily interested in whether the variable affects the outcome, but instead we're interested in whether a variable affects the relationship between a different predictor and the outcome. So for example, some questions we might be asking in this domain would be things like, does the relationship of job satisfaction and job performance depend on someone's tenure? So might the relationship look one way if someone is very tenured, or might it look another way if they're a newcomer to the company? Also, another question we could ask that's in this same domain is, does the relationship of conscientiousness and job commitment depend on the type of agreeableness or the level of agreeableness? So if you're really agreeable, if you're an easygoing person, maybe conscientiousness has a strong relationship with job commitment. But if you're not agreeable, if you're a grumpy person who's disruptive, maybe conscientiousness and job commitment has a weak relationship. Maybe that relationship isn't as strong. So as you can see in these two instances, we're asking questions of not necessarily does tenure or agreeableness have a direct effect on the outcomes of performance and job commitment, but instead do they affect the relationship between a separate predictor and the outcome of interest. One way we could visualize this is this chart right here. So as you can see, we have a predictor having a direct effect on the outcome. The line from the predictor goes straight to the outcome. And as you can see, we have a moderator there. That's what that's called. When we're doing moderation, we are going to have a moderator. And as you see, the line from the moderator does not go to the outcome. We could add a line that does. That wouldn't be an issue at all. But in this example, the line from the moderator does not go to the outcome. It instead goes to that other line because we're interested in the effect of the moderator on the relationship between the predictor and the outcome, not necessarily the direct effect of the moderator. Like I said, we could test that direct effect. We could add that direct line from the moderator to the outcome, but it's not necessary when we're doing moderation with regression. Instead, that line just has to go to that other line between the other predictor and the outcome. So as I said, this is called moderation. You could also call it interactions, or you could call it interactive effects. Any of those would work, but we're going to call it moderation, and we're going to learn how to test that with moderation with regression. So for some of y'all, you might be thinking, oh, this is ringing some bells. I think this seems similar to something we discussed earlier in the semester. And that's because we already learned about interactions during week 5 of this course. In week 5 of this course, we covered ANOVA with 2 variables. We covered ANOVA when you have 2 different categorical variables. And when you have ANOVA with 2 different categorical variables, you can also test for interactive effects. The definition we used then was when the effect of one variable depends on the other and vice versa, and this definition can still apply. We can still apply the definition for an interaction of when the effect of one variable depends on the other and vice versa. So in this example, we'd be saying the effect of the predictor depends on the moderator, and you can see it in that chart. The effect of the predictor on the outcome does depend on that moderator. But it could also be vice versa. We could very easily just flip it around where the moderator would be having the direct effect on the outcome, and the predictor could, instead of pointing to the outcome, point to that other line. We could very easily do that. So another way to think about moderation, to think about interactive effects, is whether the effect of one variable depends on the other, and vice versa. So out of all the definitions I just gave you, just pick the one you think is easiest and stick with that one because they all work. So if you remember from week 5, this is how we would often depict moderated effects. It would look something like this, where we would have bar charts, and we would have where, in many of the examples, all the bars would be an equal height, except when you found that one special combination, the bar would be significantly higher or significantly lower. So in this example, across all the conditions, the GPA was 2, except for when you had junior or senior business majors. In that case, the GPA went up to 3.75, and this would be an interactive effect. So in this example, it wasn't necessarily the thing that predicted GPA. It wasn't necessarily just whether you're a business or a non-business major. It wasn't necessarily just if you're a freshman or sophomore or junior or senior, and instead was that special combination between major and academic year. And in this instance, the special combination was when you had business students who were either junior or seniors. There is that interactive effect, and they had a much higher GPA than everyone else. So now that we're talking about moderation using regression, we're not going to use bar charts though. This is something that we are looking at with moderation when you're doing ANOVA. So when you're doing moderation with regression, instead, we're going to look at line charts. And this shows pretty much the exact same information as before. We just look at it a different way, and now we can create more categories. Now, since we're looking at things that we try to treat as continuous, in this case it doesn't really work, we'll ignore that for now. But when we're looking at things that we consider continuous, we're going to make line charts. And we're going to display the moderation or the interaction effects via these line charts. So this example shows pretty much the same information as before. As you can see, for most of the instances, the GPA is right around 2. So if you look at that orange line, that's for non-business majors. No matter what year they are, their GPA is 2. So if you're a non-business major, it doesn't matter what's going on, you're going to have a GPA of 2. And in this example, if you're a business major, when you're a freshman, your GPA is going to be 2. However, once you start going up in academic year, your GPA starts going up. That, as you can see with business majors, if you're a sophomore, it becomes a 3. If you're a junior, it becomes a 4. And if you're a senior, somehow you're magically making your GPA a 5. I know that doesn't really make sense, but we'll ignore that for now. So take a look at this and see if you can tell me why this would probably be a significant moderating effect. So take a second, think about it, and then tell me why this would probably be a significant moderating effect. Okay, so as you hopefully said, in this example, the relationship between academic year and GPA strongly depends on whether someone is a business or a non-business major. So once again, in this example, the relationship between academic year and GPA strongly depends on whether you're a business or a non-business major. So as you can see, if you're a non-business major, there is no relationship between academic year and GPA. Because if you're a non-business major, it doesn't matter if you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, your GPA is always going to be the same. Makes no difference. However, if you're a business major, there is a very strong relationship between your academic year and your GPA. There's a very strong relationship. So for business majors, the higher up in academic year you went, the higher up you went with your GPA. So that's a very strong relationship. Whereas if you're a non-business major, that relationship isn't near as strong. Okay, so hopefully you understand that right now. So one question you might be asking though is, why do we care about moderation? Why in the world do we care about moderation? And one reason is sometimes the true nature of relationships can be hidden unless we test for moderating effects. So in other words, there might be a strong relationship between two variables that cannot be discovered unless you account for the effect of the third. So sometimes there will be two variables that at first look we think, oh, there's no relationship there, there's nothing going on there. But once you account for the effect of the third, once you test for that moderating effect of that third variable, suddenly that relationship appears. And sometimes that relationship can be extremely strong, where otherwise we would have thought it doesn't exist at all. So let's look at this example. So going back to the classic example we keep on going back to over and over and over again, we might be looking at job satisfaction and job performance. So in this example, there is no relationship. It doesn't matter what your job satisfaction is. In this example, job performance is always 5. Whether your job satisfaction is a 1 or a 10, your job performance is always a 5. So if we just studied that, if we just looked at that direct effect, we would think there's no real relationship there. We would just move on and that would be that. However, let's say we account for tenure and the relationship looks like this. What would you say? What would you think about that? Hopefully you would say, wow, that's a really strong relationship. That's an enormous relationship. Because in this example, if your job tenure is low, your relationship between job performance and job satisfaction is extremely strong and positive. Then as you can see, if your job tenure is low, which is the blue line, your relationship between your job satisfaction and job performance is almost a perfect relationship. I think in this example it is a perfect relationship. That your job satisfaction is 1, your job performance is 1. Your job satisfaction is 2, your job performance is 2. Your job satisfaction is 3, your job performance is 3, etc., so on and so on. You get the point. And then on the other hand, if your job tenure is high, your job satisfaction has a very strong but negative relationship with job performance. That when your job satisfaction is 1, your job performance is 10. When your job satisfaction is 2, your job performance is 9, etc., etc. And I know that doesn't really make sense theoretically, but this is a good visual example of how otherwise we would think there's no relationship whatsoever between these two variables. But then when we account for the effect of that third, when we test for that moderating effect, that moderating variable, we see that the relationship can be extremely strong. We see that relationship suddenly appears and it's extremely strong. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind that that can happen when you're doing your analyses, when you're looking at your results. And here's another quick example. Sometimes we might look at a relationship such as conscientiousness and job commitment. Well, you might think that relationship is very weak. That even though we do see the line going up a little bit, it's not really going up that much. So we might think, oh, that's not that important of a relationship. But once we account for the moderator, such as agreeableness, we see that in some conditions that relationship is extremely weak, such as when there's low agreeableness, but it gets significantly stronger when there's high agreeableness. So as you can see in this example, when there's low agreeableness, the relationship between conscientiousness and job commitment barely goes up at all. It barely has a relationship. However, when there is high agreeableness, the relationship between conscientiousness and job commitment is pretty strong. It goes up pretty steeply. So there you go. Sometimes you can have weak relationships that then become strong. Sometimes you can have null relationships that then become extremely strong. You just have to test for those moderating effects. So before we tested these interactions with ANOVA, and this is when our predictor and moderator were categorical and particularly dichotomous variables, but now we're going to test them with regression. Now we're going to test these moderated variables with regression. And why would we use regression versus ANOVA? We typically use regression for moderation when our predictor and moderator is continuous. So if we have two continuous variables, so things measured on a Likert scale, maybe things like age, height, weight, anything that's continuous, we tend to use regression to test moderation. However, it should be noted you can also use regression to test other instances of moderation. It doesn't just have to be continuous variables. It can be continuous and dichotomous. It can technically even be two dichotomous variables. The point is regression is pretty strong, and it's pretty strong for using or for wanting to do analyses of moderation. So therefore, it's pretty frequent to use regression for tests of moderation, especially when you have two continuous variables. So let's go ahead and start with the easiest example. And the easiest example is using regression to analyze one predictor and one moderator. So in this example, we're going to have one predictor, we're going to have one moderator, and we're going to use regression to analyze whether the relationship of the predictor and the outcome depends on the moderator or not, and technically vice versa. So to do this, our data set would have three variables. One would be the predictor, one would be the moderator, and one would be the outcome. So we're just going to have three variables to start in our data set. So I'm just going to walk through an example, just a very bare bones basic example of how you would do this, and then I'll walk through an example in Excel. So this is just what our data set would look like. We might have job satisfaction, we might have tenure, and we might have an outcome. So we would just have these three variables in our data set. So to start, we have to do a thing called mean centering. So we would need to mean center our predictor and our moderator variables. And to mean center, we calculate the mean of our variable, and then we subtract the mean from each value or observation of that variable. So we have to calculate the mean of a variable, then we have to subtract that mean from each observation of that variable. So let's look at our data set. As I said, the predictor was job satisfaction, the moderator was tenure, and we have an outcome. So we would go ahead and calculate the mean of job satisfaction and the mean of tenure. So in this example, the means are 5 and 8. So in this example, our mean of job satisfaction is 5. So we would subtract 5 from each value of job satisfaction. And our mean for tenure is 8. So we'd subtract 8 from each observation of tenure. So we would add those two columns to our data set, and we would call them something like job satisfaction centered because we're mean centering, and tenure centered because once again we're mean centering. So we would take each of those job satisfaction values and subtract 5, each of those tenure values and subtract 8, and those new values we would put in those new columns. So now we have 5 columns in our data set. We have the original 3, our predictor, moderator, and outcome, but we also have those mean-centered variables. So then we need to create one last variable, one new variable, that is these new mean-centered variables multiplied together. So we take the new mean-centered variables and we multiply them together. So we have job satisfaction centered times tenure centered. And we call this the interaction term. We call this creating the interaction term. So we have these new variables that are centered, we multiply them together, and that's our interaction term. And as you can see, this is an example of creating that interaction term. We now have that new column that's JS, job satisfaction centered, times T, tenure centered, and we just multiplied all those variables together. We multiplied the job satisfaction column job satisfaction centered column times the tenure centered column. And that gives us the job satisfaction centered times tenure centered column. Then after that, you just perform a typical regression. However, you only use the centered variables and the interaction term. Make sure you include only those centered variables and the interaction term. Do not include the original variables, and do not forget to put the centered variables in there. You would actually be surprised. As you all know, I'm a college professor. As you may know, I do a lot of research, a pretty significant amount of research. Part of the research process is I also have to review other professors' statistical results, their projects, their studies. That's the word I was looking for. I often have to review other professors' studies. You would be very surprised how often even other professors will send me moderation results where they use the wrong predictors. They forget to use the centered predictors. Or you would be surprised how often they send me results where they just did a regression with the interaction term and they forgot to include the centered variables. You would be very surprised. So please do not forget doing this. If you forget, you will get the questions wrong on your exam. Okay, so here's moderation with regression. This might be what the results would look like. In this you can see that we have job satisfaction centered on one line, tenure centered on the other, and then job satisfaction times tenured on the third. So if we look at this result, we can see that the JS centered and T centered are not significant if we go over to that T column. So we would say that there's not necessarily a significant direct effect. However, you can see that interaction term is significant. You can see job satisfaction times tenure is significant. It's very strongly significant in this example. So therefore, we would say that there is a significant interactive effect. The job satisfaction and tenure do have a relationship with our outcome, and we would say that the relationship between the two depend on the other. So the relationship between job satisfaction and the outcome depends on tenure, and the relationship between tenure and the outcome depends on job satisfaction. So they do both jointly have a significant effect on the outcome. Okay, so I will say we're not going to learn in this class exactly how to interpret these results. Typically what most people do is once they find a significant interactive effect, they do go back and make a chart. That's a very easy way to interpret the results. We already covered, or hopefully last semester you covered how to make a chart in Excel, how to make different types of charts. So if you do have a significant interactive effect, you could go ahead and make a chart to explore what that interactive effect looks like, but we're not going to cover that in this course mainly due to time constraints. I will say, however, there's tons of online resources to investigate that, and also there are definitely other stats courses you can take in the College of Business that will teach you how to do that. And unfortunately, we're not going to cover that this semester due to time constraints. Instead, we're just going to learn the analysis part. We're just going to learn how to figure out if there's a significant moderating effect, and then that might be up to you to figure out how to interpret it, how to make the graph to understand exactly what's going on, or to sign up for a different class that will teach you how to do that. But for now, you do know how to test for moderating effects, so you do therefore know how to find if there's a significant moderating effect with your data. Okay, do you have any questions? If so, go ahead and pause the video. Go ahead and pause this video. If you do have any questions, send me an email. But otherwise, I'm going to give a quick rundown of how to do all of this in Excel. I'm going to do a quick rundown of how to test for moderation in Excel. You don't need to follow along with me, and this will be almost identical, probably completely identical, to what will be presented in the guide that I provide from mattchauer.com. However, this has a ton of steps. This has a lot of steps. So I want you to go ahead and just watch me go through the steps. Just try to see if you can pick up some tricks. And then once you go through with the guide, that might make it easier. Because I do have a decent amount of students who send me emails saying, I'm stuck on step 6 of the guide. I don't know what to do. And then I have to say, well, go back and watch the lecture video because I go through the guide for you. And that, honestly, this is to save me a lot of time, so I don't have to respond to each of those emails individually explaining each of the steps. With that noted, here we go. So once again, we're looking at job satisfaction predicting performance, and we're looking at the moderating effect of agreeableness. So we're trying to see whether agreeableness changes the relationship between job satisfaction and performance. So therefore, we're going to do moderated regression. We're going to test for that interactive effect, and hopefully we're going to find significance, but we'll see. Okay, so to start, we open up our data set, and as we just now discussed, the very first thing we want to do is to make those centered variables, to make those mean-centered variables. So how are we going to do that? We first need to add 2 new columns to our data set, and in my opinion, it's the easiest just to add those next to our existing columns. So go ahead and add 2 columns, and they're going to be the columns we're going to make our mean-centered variables in. So you can add those columns really wherever you want to. It's once you get to the guide, it's up to you, but always typically add them next to my existing variables. So then the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to have to calculate the means of our predictor and of our moderator. So because we're mean centering, we need to calculate those means. We need to figure out what we should subtract by. So to do that, we're going to calculate the mean of our predictor and of our moderator. So as you hopefully know by now, to calculate mean in Excel, just a quick, easy way to do it is to type in equals average and then open parenthesis. So it's equals average and then open parenthesis. And then we drag and highlight everything we want to calculate the average of. We drag and highlight with our mouse everything we want to calculate the average of. So to start, go ahead and do it for job satisfaction, close that parenthesis, and then hit enter. So in sum, you should have equals average, open parenthesis, you should highlight all of that data for job satisfaction, close the parenthesis, and then hit enter. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for agreeableness. Go ahead and do the same thing for agreeableness. And now we have both the averages in those 2 cells. So the average for job satisfaction was 3.333 repeating, and the average for agreeableness was just 4.1. So now we're going to want to go ahead and mean center. So to do that, we're going to start by in that first cell right there for that new column we made. We're going to want to type in equal. After we type in equal, we click on the cell we want to mean center. So we just click on that first job satisfaction cell. And then we do subtract by 3.33333 repeating. We want to go ahead and type in that 3.333 repeating instead of just clicking on that average we did before, because that makes it easier down the road. So just go ahead and type in the average rather than trying to refer to the average by clicking on that cell. So long story short, at the end, this cell should just have equals. You should then click on the first job satisfaction cell you want to mean center, and then subtract by 3.333 repeating. and then hit enter. Once you do that, the results should now be in that cell. Go ahead and click on that cell and then double click that little square in the bottom right hand corner of that cell. Go ahead and, like I said, you should have the result in that cell. Click on that cell and then double click on that little square in the bottom right hand corner. And if you did it correctly, it should go ahead and copy that command for all the rest of the cells, and it will automatically mean center all the rest of those observations. So you do not, for the love of God, need to type in all of those individual subtraction commands. You just double click that little box and then it'll copy that command for all those other cells. I fairly frequently have students tell me, I really struggled with your class. I had to retype those commands 100 times for each assignment. I don't know why you made me do that. And every time I tell them, well, in the lecture videos and the guides, I told you how to do that. Please read, please watch my videos. It saves you so much time in the future just by watching an extra 10-15 minutes of the video. So go ahead, copy all that by double clicking that box, and it might take a few tries to do it correctly, but eventually it should work. Okay, so now we're going to want to do the exact same thing for the agreeableness column. So we're going to want to type in equal and then click on the first agreeableness cell. So equal, click on the first agreeableness cell, and then we're going to subtract by 4.1 because that was the average of agreeableness. So it should be equal the first agreeableness cell minus 4.1. And then once again, we're going to want to double click on that box and copy that command for all of the other agreeableness cells. So we're going to double click on that box, and then we're going to copy that command for all those other agreeableness cells. So if you did it correctly, we should now have both of our variables mean centered. Good job. Congratulations for making it this far. So both of our variables should now be mean centered. Now we're going to need to make the interaction term. Now we're going to do the interaction term. So to do that, once again, add a new column to your data set, and give it a title. I like to call it whatever the abbreviation is for my variables with an X in the middle. So in this example, it's JS for job satisfaction, X, A for agreeableness. And then we're just going to tell Excel to multiply the two cells together for each row that we want to. So for this very first row, we type in equals, and then we click on the first cell for our center job satisfaction, and then we do times, and then we click on the first cell for agreeableness. So it's equal, the first cell for job satisfaction centered, times the first cell for agreeableness centered, and then we just hit enter. So once you hit enter, once again, double click that little box in the bottom right hand corner of the cell, and it will copy everything you put in that cell for all the other cells in that column. So now we have job satisfaction centered, now we have agreeableness centered, and now we have the interaction term. Now we have that interaction term. So we're good to go. We're pretty happy now. However, there's one thing you have to do before you run your regression in Excel, and this is one reason why I tend to dislike Excel. It's not a user-friendly program at all. We need to make sure all those new columns we created are next to each other. And we also need to make sure that those values are going to stay the same when we edit our data set to make them next to each other. So to do that, once again, we're doing this because if we have to move our columns around because regression forces our predictors to be next to each other when we're doing it in Excel. And also the way we currently made those columns, if we move them around, it could change the values. Silly, I know. That's one reason why I don't like Excel, but that's a whole other story. So we have to figure out a way to make the columns stay as they are and then later be able to move them around. The easiest way to do that is click on that highlighted button, and that selects everything in your sheet. So click on that highlighted button, and unfortunately I wasn't able to copy and paste this into a picture because when I tried to, Excel wouldn't let me copy and paste it. I know that sounds silly, but it just wouldn't. But this next step, so first we click on that button that's highlighted, that selects everything. I want you to then right click and click on copy. So you're going to right click and click on copy. So that should copy everything to your cursor. And then you want to right click and go to paste, but you want to do a special type of paste. In your version of Excel, there should hopefully be a command that says paste as numbers. So when you right click, there should be a few options that pop up and there might be a few symbols. hover your mouse over those symbols until you see one that says paste as text. I know that's confusing. I really wish I could have showed you a picture, but Excel wouldn't let me copy and paste or take a screenshot of that. I know it's silly. I can't really do anything about it. But once again, click on that button that's highlighted to highlight everything, right click and click on copy, and then right click again on your numbers and click on paste as numbers. So what that does is it takes everything that we previously made as a formula. So everything that we previously made as a formula, if we were to move that, would have changed those numbers because it was a formula. So if we were to move it, it would have changed the numbers. So now that we copied everything and repasted it as numbers, so because we copied everything and repasted it as raw numbers, now when we move your cells, now that when we move your columns, those numbers will stay the same because it changed it from formulas to the actual raw numbers. So everything that was previously formulas are now numbers, so when you move them, they should stay the same. Okay, with that noted, now go ahead and delete the original job satisfaction and agreeableness columns. So now I want you to go ahead and delete the original job satisfaction and agreeableness columns. So one way to do that is to click on the column header, so the A up there for job satisfaction, and then just right click and hit delete. So click on the A, right click and hit delete, or you could hit the delete key. There's many ways you could go about it, but you just want to get those columns completely gone. And then you want to do the same for agreeableness. So you could hit the C at the top, highlight that column, and then you want to delete that column entirely. So right click and hit delete, hit the delete button, it's up to you. But at the end, your data set should look like this. At the end, your data set should look like this. You should just have your mean-centered variables, your interaction term, and your outcome. So as you can see with those arrows are pointing at where now the original agreeableness and the original job satisfaction columns are now missing. They're now no longer there. So therefore our data set just has job satisfaction centered, agreeableness centered, and the interaction term. And we needed to do that because when you do regression in Excel, your predictors have to be next to each other. And if there is those other columns in between them, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked out. So therefore, we can now do regression with our data set. So as always, go to data analysis. This new window pops up, click on regression, click on OK. And then you need to tell it your predictor variable. You need to tell it your Y range, so click on that highlighted button. Highlight all of the data for performance, including the label. So all the data for performance, including the label. Hit that other highlighted button. Now you need to click on this other button that's highlighted. That's for your predictor data. Highlight all of your predictor data, including the label, and then hit that other highlighted button. And then tell Excel that you highlighted the labels. So click on that labels box. And then finally, after all of that, push OK. So now we should have our output data highlighted, our input data highlighted, our predictor data highlighted, I should say. We should have told it we included the labels, and then we push OK. Okay, so this is what our results should look like. I accidentally included an arrow there. Ignore that arrow, but this is our results. So as we can see with this first line, that's the direct effect of job satisfaction. And as you can see, it's actually statistically significant. The p-value is less than 0.05. It's very close, but it is less. So there is a significant direct effect of job satisfaction. This is the direct effect of our moderator. As we can see, that's above 0.05. So there was no significant direct effect of agreeableness. So there was no significant direct effect of agreeableness. And then the very last thing, this is the interaction term. So this is job satisfaction times agreeableness. This is our interaction term. And as you can see, the p-value is greater than 0.05. The p-value is greater than 0.05. So in this example, there was a significant direct effect of job satisfaction. There was not a significant effect of agreeableness, and the interaction term was not significant. So to put that all together, the direct effect of job satisfaction was significant in predicting job performance. The direct effect of agreeableness was not significant in predicting job performance, and the interaction term of job satisfaction and agreeableness was not significant in predicting job performance. So therefore, the effect of job satisfaction on performance does not depend on agreeableness, and vice versa. That the magnitude, the strength, the direction of that relationship did not depend on agreeableness, and the effect of agreeableness on performance did not depend on job satisfaction. So there is just a significant direct effect, and nothing else was significant. Okay, so that's everything for moderation with regression. Hopefully you partially understand it right now, and then hopefully once you complete the guide, once you go through all these steps yourself, you're going to truly understand it fully. So go ahead, open up that guide that's in the comments below, complete it, and then hopefully you'll understand moderation with regression in Excel. And as always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Always happy to chat. But otherwise, good luck on your homework.